On the 24th of June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, led La Grande Armée into the Russian Empire. When news of the invasion reached Tsar Alexander I, he ordered a messenger to head south to recall Russia's greatest general, Mikhail Kutuzov, from Ukraine, where he'd been living in a kind of internal exile. In the months that followed, he played a key role in defeating the French invasion. Why had Kutuzov fallen into disrepute with the Tsar? And how did he defeat one of the greatest military commanders in history at the head of the largest invasion forces the world had yet seen? This is the story of Mikhail Kutuzov, the savior of Russia. The man known to history as Mikhail Kutuzov was almost certainly born on the 5th of September 1747 in an uncertain location in the Russian Empire. This was the 16th of September 1747 according to the Gregorian calendar, which is used worldwide today and which was already in use across most of Europe, though not in Russia, where the Julian calendar still prevailed when Mikhail was born. We only have the date of Mikhail's birth from an official record and not the year. It consequently used to be believed that he was born in September 1745. However, additional evidence has come to light in recent times, which indicates that Kutuzov's sister Anna, who was born in August 1746, was older than him, meaning he must have been born in 1747 or later. Mikhail himself stated that he was 43 years old in January 1791, which appears to confirm that he was born on the 5th of September 1747. His father was Ilarion Matveyevich Kutuzov, a lieutenant general in the Russian military and a leading figure in the Corps of Engineers. He was a highly educated man by 18th century Russian standards and was nicknamed Rozumnaya Kniga, meaning the wise book, by those who knew him in the military and at court. A workaholic and prolific engineer, over a period of more than 20 years, he worked ceaselessly on engineering projects like the construction of the military arsenal of St. Petersburg and the Yekaterinitsky Canal, which protected the city from bouts of flooding. He had married Anna Bedrinskaya in 1745. Very little is known about her, and for a time historians were not even sure that she was Mikhail's mother. While this has been confirmed by historians in modern times, all that is otherwise known about her is that she hailed from a middling family of the minor Russian nobility. Kutuzov was born in a period of rapid change in Russia. Just 2 centuries earlier, there had barely been a Russian state. In the 15th century, Russia consisted of a number of principalities and republics like Muscovy, Novgorod, Pskov, and Tver that lay on the upper course of the Volga River. Further south, various Mongol and Turkish Khanates ruled the Caucasus and parts of Ukraine north of the Black Sea as vestiges of the Mongol conquests. Sweden controlled the area around where St. Petersburg lies today, while east of the Ural Mountains was a thinly inhabited wilderness that was not part of any Russian state. In the 16th century, the Duchy of Muscovy emerged as a unifier of the Russian principalities. It then expanded down the Volga towards the Caspian Sea, and a Tsardom of Russia was declared under Muscovite rule. In the 17th century, Russia expanded further west at the expense of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The real era of modernization came, though, during the long reign of Peter the Great between 1682 and 1725. He conquered territory from Sweden during the Great Northern War, which gave Russia access to the Baltic Sea, a triumph that he capped by building a great new capital there, which he christened St. Petersburg. Peter also began an aggressive campaign of modernization. That process would accelerate during Kutuzov's lifetime. catapulting Russia to become one of the foremost powers of Europe, both politically and militarily. Considering the fame he later acquired in the 19th century, surprisingly little is known about the early life of Mikhail Kutuzov. What little we know about his first years indicates an early tragedy. His sister Daria's birth in 1755 was complicated and claimed Mikhail's mother's life. With his father serving the government, the children were raised thereafter on the estate of Mikhail's maternal grandparents in the Pskov region, where his grandmother Praskovya Bedrinskaya took on the role of surrogate mother. We can only guess at the rest of his upbringing here. He would have interacted with a lot of serfs in a rural society that was quite medieval still, even by the middle of the 18th century. Their early education would have been informal, with Orthodox priests and local bureaucrats providing Mikhail and his siblings with a rudimentary education, teaching them to read and write, the basics of the new sciences, and to speak French, the lingua franca of the continent in the 18th century. In later years, Mikhail was able to speak Russian, German, French, Latin, Polish, Swedish, and Turkish, as he became an accomplished linguist. He periodically visited his father while he was serving in Riga during Mikhail's youth. His life in the late 1750s was spent moving between his grandparents' estate in Pskov to Riga, where his father was stationed in the Latvian city, and at the imperial court in St. Petersburg. In Riga, he learned the basics of military command, while in the capital he served an apprenticeship as a courtier, developing the political acumen needed for any successful military career. Eventually, his military education was formalized, and he was sent to the Joint Artillery and Engineer Noble School. He was first enrolled here in 1759, and his training there continued through to early 1762. Within days of graduating in February 1762, he was appointed to serve under Prince Peter August Friedrich, Duke of Schleswig-Holstein, a German noble who had moved to Russia years earlier. It was an auspicious appointment for a young graduate. However, a palace coup in the summer of 1762 led to the deposing of the recently ascended Tsar Peter III and the rise to power of his wife, Catherine. This would quickly have implications for Kutuzov. The woman who would become known as Empress Catherine the Great quickly moved to consolidate control over the state by appointing military figures to new offices and removing those who had been loyal to Peter. This meant that the Duke of Schleswig-Holstein was demoted, and Mikhail was reassigned to serve under a new mentor, Alexander Suvorov. Suvorov became the leading general of Catherine's reign. In an era of changing warfare, he emphasized the need for speed in campaigns and the use of mobile artillery trains. Once assigned to serve under him, Suvorov quickly took the young Kutuzov under his wing. Much of his apprenticeship would be served in military engagements with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a state that had once been a great power and still ruled over Poland, Lithuania, and western and central Ukraine, though the Commonwealth was in decline. In the 1760s, there was virtual civil war within it as powerful nobles resisted the central government after the accession of King Stanislav II August in 1764. Empress Catherine threw her support behind Stanislav, her sometime lover. Kutuzov served his military apprenticeship in the resulting Russian engagements in Poland. These initial forays and his apprenticeship under Suvorov clearly went well. In 1766, when Catherine formed a legislative commission to review and codify the laws of the Russian Empire, Mikhail was one of just 22 military officers selected to form part of the commission, despite being short of his 20th year. His precocious promotion was partly owing to his personality. Kutuzov charmed those whom he knew in his youth, though rumors of a sexual relationship with Catherine were no more than salacious speculation at court. In 1768, war broke out in Poland after a confederacy of the leading Polish nobles was formed at Bar in the Podolia region in Ukraine. Kutuzov served in the ensuing War of the Bar Confederation, which went on down to 1772. It is clear from contemporary accounts and a number of Russian histories of the 19th century by Philip Sinelnikov that Kutuzov played a substantial part in the war, but many of the original records that might shine a light thereon were lost during the tumultuous decades of the first half of the 20th century in Russia. What is evident is that his actions in Poland galvanized his reputation as a military commander of some ability. He won victories against the Polish nobles at engagements near Schwaniec and Okupe, and was soon being considered for further promotion. The only thing which prevented him from being promoted to the rank of captain at the end of the 1760s was his young age. Clearly, there was some jealousy towards his swift promotion, and the favour shown towards him by both Catherine and Suvorov. The War of the Bar Confederation ended in 1772, with the first of the three partitions of Poland, whereby Russia, Prussia, and Austria began dividing up the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth between them. During his younger years, while he was still being mentored by Suvorov, Mikhail would have been keenly aware that the Ottoman Turks were the primary antagonists of Russia. The Ottoman Empire had emerged in the 15th and 16th centuries as one of the world's great powers, conquering the Balkans, Asia Minor, most of the Middle East, and the Maghreb. Its power also extended into the Caucasus and to the northern edges of the Black Sea. In the 17th century, the Ottomans had reached the peak of their power, laying siege to the city of Vienna in 1683 as they threatened to break into Central Europe. The attack on the Austrian capital perturbed the powers of Europe, and a Christian alliance of powers like Austria, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Hungarian princes, and Russia was formed to take the fight to the Turks. By the end of the Great Turkish War in 1700, the Ottomans were being pushed back, and Russia acquired greater territory in the Azov region to the north of the Black Sea. It was the beginning of a period in which several wars were fought between Russia and the Ottomans in the 18th and 19th centuries, as the Russians sought to acquire greater amounts of territory from the Turks north of the Black Sea and in the Caucasus. 3 major wars would be fought between the Turks and the Russians during Kutuzov's career. Thus, while he is primarily remembered for his role in the Napoleonic Wars, Kutuzov would actually spend a greater proportion of his life fighting the Ottoman Empire. The first of the Russo-Turkish Wars that Kutuzov was involved in broke out in 1768. It began as an extension of the War of the Bar Confederation as the fighting spilled over into Moldavia and Wallachia, the Ottoman provinces in the northeast of the Balkans. Polish and Cossack opponents of the Russians fled into Ottoman territory here, and the Turks sought to exploit the situation to wage war on Russia, hoping that with Catherine the Great's government focused on affairs in Poland, they would be able to reclaim some of the territory north of the Black Sea that they had lost to the Russians in the last major war back in the 1730s. At the same time, Sultan Mustafa III was also provoked into the conflict when Russian divisions crossed over the Kodyma River into Ottoman territory and carried out a massacre in the town of Balta. Kutuzov was not involved in the war for the first year and a half. Instead, he was active against the Poles during this period. He was only dispatched southwards to fight the Turks early in 1770, when reinforcements in the shape of the Smolensky Infantry Regiment were sent to assist Count Peter Romantsiev, who had emerged as the head of the Turkish front in the wars in the course of 1769. In short order, Mikhail was promoted to become divisional quartermaster of the general headquarters by Rumyantsev, effectively placing him in charge of the logistics of the main army fighting the Turks on the Balkans front. Over the next 4 years, he would experience a variety of good and bad luck here, and further east in Crimea. The first 2 years of Kutuzov's service against the Turks were marked by a string of successes. He participated in the Battle of Kagol in Moldova on the 1st of August 1770, and then played a critical role in the last stages of the siege of the fortress of Bender in the same region in September. He led the final assault at Bender on the night of the 27th of September. Huge Russian mines were set off underneath the walls, and Mikhail led the attack into the breach that was opened in the walls, spending several hours fighting in the darkness until the Ottoman garrison finally surrendered in the early hours. When dawn came, a Russian flag was flying over the fortress. 1771, though, brought setbacks as the newly appointed Turkish vizier, Silahddar Mehmed Pasha, introduced a more effective military strategy against the Russians. Then, an unfortunate incident led to Kutuzov's demotion in 1772. The Russians and Turks were laid up in their respective camps in Moldova and southern Ukraine, as abortive peace talks were underway. During the hiatus, a night of drinking ensued amongst the Russian officers. At one point, Kutuzov imitated Rumyantsev's mannerisms, only to find several days later that this had been reported to the field marshal. Rumyantsev was a decent commander, but also a vain man who did not respond well to being mocked. He struck Kutuzov from the list of those who were in line for promotion. In an effort to redeem himself, he applied to be transferred to the Crimea Peninsula, a second major front in the war with the Turks. Here he would have as close a shave with death as it was possible to have. The war in the Crimea was a mix of land and naval clashes as the Russians sought to overrun the peninsula, while the Turks reinforced their positions with ships from the Black Sea. By the summer of 1774, the wider war was reaching a climax as Kutuzov's old mentor, Suvorov, was leading a last major push southwards into what is now Bulgaria, and an effort to secure the last Ottoman positions in the Crimean Peninsula was also initiated. Kutuzov was ordered with his divisions to capture the town of Alushta on the southern coast of Crimea on the 4th of August, unaware that peace terms had already been agreed in the Balkans. Fierce resistance was met at Alushta, with the Ottomans having dug a series of trenches in the approach to the town. In an effort to lead by example, Mikhail charged forward. As he did so, an Ottoman bullet struck him in the head. However, the bullet didn't lodge. It passed between his eye and his left temple and then went through his skull and passed out the other side. On impact, he fell backwards and landed amongst the dead on the ground. Miraculously, he survived as the bullet missed his brain. He was very badly wounded, though. Thus, as the Russo-Turkish War came to an end, with the Russians acquiring full control over the Crimea and extensive privileges granted to Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, Mikhail was taken northwards to St. Petersburg. His life hung in the balance, but eventually he recovered. His right eye was damaged and the sight was diminished in it permanently, though he did not lose the sight fully in it, and he never wore the eye patch which some fanciful portraits of him subsequently suggested he did. It was a miraculous escape from death's door. Mikhail recovered in the course of late 1774 and early 1775. Empress Catherine awarded him 1,000 gold rubles to pay for his medical bills, as well as a year's furlough pay from the army. He was also given the Order of St. George, a newly created honor in the Russian imperial forces. With his financial situation secured for some time, he took the opportunity to embark on a grand tour of Europe, visiting Germany, Austria, the Dutch Republic, and Italy. News of his miraculous survival from the gunshot wound he had sustained spread, and he was a minor celebrity when he visited the courts at Vienna and Berlin. It was not all fun, though. He was left with frequent headaches for years to come, and friends noted that he was more prone to morose moods following his near-death experience. Back in Russia, he began a relationship with Yekaterina Bibikova, the daughter of Ilya Bibikov, a military engineer who had known Mikhail's father for many years. Kutuzov would have met Ekaterina on several occasions during their younger years, and they began a formal courtship during his period of convalescence in the mid-1770s. She was noted for her wit and love of the theatre. Contemporaries remarked on his intelligence and charm, one observer stating that, quote, "He did not just speak, but rather played with his tongue like another Mozart or Rossini, enchanting listeners." They were a natural match and were married on the 8th of May 1778. 6 children followed, 5 daughters between 1779 and 1789, and a son named Nicholas in 1790. The only boy would die from smallpox in childhood. Apart from this, the marriage was only marred by Mikhail's prolonged absences over the years on military duty. The years following his marriage are again ones for which there is a decided lack of concrete information concerning Kutuzov's career. He became close to Prince Grigory Potemkin during the 1780s, a leading Russian minister who was the lover of Catherine the Great. Under Potemkin's patronage, Kutuzov gained several appointments in southwestern Russia and Ukraine in the 1780s. In 1786, he composed a military treatise entitled Remarks on Infantry Service in General, and that of the Jaegers in particular, outlining his ideas about the employment of light cavalry. It is generally overshadowed by military treatises of the era, like Karl von Clausewitz's On War. Yet Kutuzov's is an important statement on military tactics in the late 18th century. In the summer of 1787, a fresh war erupted between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. As the commander of the Bug-Jäger Corps, Mikhail was quickly assigned to the southern front in Ukraine. Incredibly, on the 29th of August 1788, while leading his men during an intense engagement around Kherson in southern Ukraine, Mikhail was shot in the head for the second time. An Austrian diplomat by the name of Charles Joseph von Ligne witnessed the event and wrote to Joseph II of Austria, explaining how the bullet hit Kutuzov's head not far away from where the previous one had entered 14 years earlier. Kutuzov survived this second shot to the head too. He had even continued to command his men after being shot until the blood loss forced him from the field. The bullet had struck him in the cheek and gone through his head, under his brain, and out through the back of his upper neck. He was once again sent to convalesce and was absent from the front for several months. However, just as in the mid-1770s, he made a fairly miraculous recovery and was back fighting the Turks in 1789. His headaches were worse thereafter though, and he had not escaped completely unscathed. The war with the Turks dragged on until 1792, when, under the terms of the Treaty of Yashi, the Ottomans acknowledged full Russian control over the Crimean Peninsula. Following it, Kutuzov was ordered back northwards to the borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. While the first partition of Poland in 1772 had stripped the Poles of much of their territory, in the early 1790s, the Polish aristocrats had decided on a reform program, which saw the adoption of one of the world's first written constitutions in 1791. Alarmed that the Commonwealth might be revitalizing itself, its neighbors responded with fresh aggression. Kutuzov was sent to the Polish border with the command of 23,000 men, his largest ever command. With these, he invaded Poland, while the Prussians did the same from the west. The second partition of Poland followed, with Russia acquiring a huge chunk of territory that encapsulated most of modern-day Belarus and central Ukraine, including the city of Minsk. The Commonwealth was reduced to a rump state that was divided up between the Russians, Prussians, and Austrians for the third and final partition of Poland in 1795. Kutuzov did not play a role in the third partition. Instead, following the military campaign against the Poles in 1792, he had been selected by Empress Catherine to become the Russian ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. The selection of a general to serve in a diplomatic role of this kind might seem unusual at first. However, it made sense. In sending Kutuzov to the capital of the Ottoman Empire, Catherine was dispatching a figure who acted as a clear reminder of the recent military defeat of the Turks by the Russians. Mikhail was also fluent in Turkish and was known for having an affable disposition that would lend itself to diplomacy. He spent 6 months as ambassador in Constantinople. It was a busy role, with Mikhail having to attend to a range of matters. The foremost was establishing the special place of Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. In between, he found time to visit many historical sites before being recalled to St. Petersburg in March 1794. Despite the brevity of his embassy, Kutuzov proved himself a skilled diplomat and not just a soldier. While Kutuzov was in Constantinople, the political and military situation in Western Europe was changing in ways which would shape the rest of his life. Back in 1789, the French Revolution had dramatically reorientated French politics. In the early 1790s, the revolution became more radical as the balance of power shifted from moderates who wanted to establish a constitutional monarchy to radicals seeking to establish a French republic. The radicals got their way in September 1792, and the following year they executed their former king and queen. By then, the French Revolutionary Wars were underway, as Austria, Prussia, and Britain allied with one another to try to destroy the revolution. The Austrians were perturbed at the treatment and eventual murder of Queen Marie Antoinette, a member of the Austrian royal family, while the British were the perennial rivals of the French. 1793 was a year of major crisis for the French revolutionaries as counter-revolutionary forces within France threatened to topple the nascent republic. But 1794 had seen the tide turn, and by the end of the year, the French were on the offensive, eventually conquering the Low Countries and much of the Rhineland in 1795, followed by victory in Italy in 1796. A young Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte emerged as a major French military commander in the process, and he would soon become the central figure in French politics. Russia played a limited role in the early stages of the French Revolutionary Wars. Russian observers would have, nevertheless, been startled to see the French resort to a concept they called the levée en masse, the mass conscription of French adult males to fight for the Republic, a development which transformed the scale and nature of European warfare. Other nations soon responded in kind, and by the end of his lifetime, Kutuzov would be commanding far larger armies than he had at the beginning of his career. Russia remained aloof from the war of the First Coalition against the French between 1792 and 1797. But by the end of the 1790s, it could no longer ignore the growth of French power. In 1799, in response to the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon, Russia signed a surprise defensive alliance with the Ottomans. They also joined the war of the Second Coalition in 1799, with Suvorov campaigning as far west as Italy. He returned to Russia in 1800 and died there shortly afterwards, an event which led to Kutuzov's appointment as Governor-General of St. Petersburg. Russia left the war with the French shortly afterwards. By that time, Napoleon had become military dictator of France as first consul, and in 1804 he declared himself to be the Emperor of the French. Kutuzov would finally emerge as a significant figure in the Napoleonic Wars when the War of the Third Coalition began in 1804, pitting Britain, Russia, Austria and Sweden against France and its allies and vassals. Kutuzov would play a central role in the climactic battle of the War of the Third Coalition, the Battle of Austerlitz, fought in what is now Czechia on the 2nd of December 1805. In the autumn that preceded it, the Russians sent tens of thousands of soldiers westwards to Central Europe to aid their Austrian allies. They could not move quickly enough to prevent Napoleon winning a stunning series of victories in the Ulm campaign in southern Germany in September and October 1805, and then moving to capture Vienna. The Austrian leadership fled from Vienna in advance of Bonaparte's arrival, and so it was a combined Austrian and Russian army that took to the field at Austerlitz in early December to try to defeat the French and retake the Austrian capital. Tsar Alexander I of Russia, Catherine the Great's grandson, who had become emperor, led the Russian contingent personally, but much of the 50,000 or so Russian troops were commanded by Kutuzov and his main rival amongst the Russian generals, Pyotr Bagration. Kutuzov held the official title of commander of the combined Russian and Austrian forces at Austerlitz, and was a field marshal by then. He had been in Central Europe even as the Ulm campaign was underway, and had been extremely critical of the Austrian military and its tactics. Then, to compound matters, when the Battle of Austerlitz approached, Kutuzov's advice that they should avoid a battle at Austerlitz and instead move towards the Carpathian Mountains in order to lure Napoleon into a trap was ignored. The disagreements led to a quarrel between Kutuzov and the Tsar, even as the battle was about to begin at Austerlitz, and he was demoted. Later, he could claim he was not responsible for the appalling defeat which was inflicted on the combined Russian and Austrian forces at Austerlitz in the hours that followed. With a numerically inferior army, Bonaparte soundly defeated the Russo-Austrian army. It was one of the lowest ebbs of Kutuzov's military career, though in addressing some of the units under his command as they departed from the battle, he stated bluntly, "You will outlive me, and hear many stories about our wars. After everything we have witnessed, one more victory or defeat would make no difference to my legacy. But I want you to remember one thing. I am not to blame for the Battle of Austerlitz." Austerlitz was a disaster for the coalition cause. The Austrians had no choice but to sue for peace, and Bonaparte dismantled the Holy Roman Empire, bringing much of Germany under his control. This immediately led to the War of the Fourth Coalition, as the Russians decided to fight on, now with Prussia entering the conflict against Napoleon again. With this, the center of the fighting switched northeastwards towards Berlin and the Prussian lands in western and northern Poland. Kutuzov would play a mixed role in it. As one of the senior Russian commanders, he was given responsibility for organizing much of the retreat of Russia's remaining forces from Central Europe back towards the lands of the Russian Empire in the winter of 1805. But thereafter he was demoted in favor of Bagration. The latter commander would play the greater role in the War of the Fourth Coalition. In the course of it, Napoleon launched a blistering campaign towards Berlin, winning significant battles at Jena and Auerstadt in eastern Germany before entering Berlin in late October 1806. King Frederick William III of Prussia was forced to flee eastwards, and the war thereafter effectively became a clash between the French and their allies and the Russians around what are now northern Poland, Lithuania, and the Kaliningrad Oblast. This would culminate in the signing of the Treaty of Tilsit in July 1807, through which Prussia was stripped of much of its territory by the French, and a French-aligned Duchy of Warsaw was created in Poland. Russia and Britain remained the only European powers which were not defeated by Napoleon. An uneasy alliance would prevail between the French and Russians for the next several years, but these were years of wilderness for Mikhail. With his situation under Tsar Alexander damaged following Austerlitz, he was exiled to Kiev to serve as governor of the city. He would spend the better part of 2 years here, before a fresh war with the Ottoman Empire saw him restored to Alexander's good graces again. He was sent to the Balkans to command in the Russo-Turkish War of 1806 to 1812. Ultimately, though, it was not long before a fresh move by Napoleon would see Kutuzov fighting the French again. When he did, it would immortalize him in the annals of European military history in the twilight of his life. By the early 1810s, Kutuzov was living a somewhat tormented existence. He had lived far beyond his means for years and was considering mortgaging some of his estates to pay off his debts. At the same time, he was on the edge of a full restoration to royal favor and had been promoted to senior command in Wallachia, the frontier region around the modern-day border between Ukraine and Romania, where the Turks and Russians were at war. It was in this environment that the situation with France suddenly changed in a way which benefited him. Napoleon's alliance with Tsar Alexander, since the Treaty of Tilsit was agreed in 1807, had rested on the idea that the Continental powers would impose staunch embargoes against the import of British goods to the continent, thus allowing Bonaparte to cripple Britain economically. Yet none of Napoleon's allies had fully abided by this continental system. Friction between Napoleon and Alexander grew over the years, and by 1811 he had decided to try to conquer Russia, the last major power able to defy him on the continent itself. Months of preparation followed, and by the summer of 1812, the French and their allies were amassing in Poland for an invasion of the Russian Empire. Finally, on the 24th of June 1812, La Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. The invasion involved around 500,000 men and was the largest military expedition ever launched in Europe up to that time. With its inception, Kutuzov was finally called home to Russia after years in exile in Ukraine and on the war front in the Balkans. His official position was to oversee the defenses of St. Petersburg, the imperial capital, as the Council of Ministers had unambiguously decided he was best suited to do so. This being said, Bonaparte's plan was to strike through Belarus and then make for Moscow, believing that if he took the old capital of Russia, the Tsar would be forced to seek terms. Time would prove his strategy to be fatally incorrect. Meanwhile, Kutuzov quickly made his way north and was in St. Petersburg by the end of July to commence several weeks of preparing the defenses of the city. They would never be needed. Kutuzov was soon promoted to a more senior role in the defense of Russia. This came after the Battle of Smolensk near the city of Minsk in the middle of August 1812. Here, the Russian contingent was commanded by Barclay de Tolly and Pyotr Bagration. They confronted an advanced division of Napoleon's invasion force of over 50,000 men. There was no intention to try to stop the French advance. Instead, the Russians were simply aiming to slow the movement of La Grande Armée. Smolensk was a disaster in this regard, with de Tolly and Bagration losing thousands of men and failing to curb the speed with which the French were moving towards Moscow. In response, Alexander decided to replace de Tolly with Kutuzov. He was in charge by the time the Battle of Borodino was fought near the village of Borodino on the final approach to Moscow on the 7th of September. This was one of the largest battles ever fought in Europe up to that time. Kutuzov led over 120,000 men out against a similar-size advance army under Napoleon. There was no intention here either to stop Bonaparte's onward march towards the old capital or to defeat him, but a slowing tactic and a morale-boosting clash were needed for the Russians. What followed was a bloody engagement as huge numbers of troops clashed with heavy artillery being used. Tens of thousands of men were killed and wounded on both sides before the Russians began an orderly withdrawal from Borodino. Thereafter, Kutuzov and the other Russian commanders made extensive use of misinformation to convince the French they intended to defend Moscow stoutly. Bonaparte would soon learn that this was not the case. After the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon and his French forces marched onwards towards Moscow. Alexander promoted Kutuzov to the rank of General Field Marshal, making him Commander-in-Chief of the Russian armed forces. On the 13th of September, he convened a meeting of top military commanders and figures in charge of the defense of Moscow, known as the Council of Filii. During this, they decided that they would abandon Moscow and leave it to the French, but they would also begin taking measures to ensure that Bonaparte would gain little from capturing the city. Foodstuffs were systematically stripped from houses and government buildings all over the city, as was wood and other fuel. Then Mikhail ordered the evacuation of the city. When Napoleon and the French began entering Moscow in mid-September, they found that over 3/4 of the inhabitants had left and that there were little resources for them to use there. Not long afterwards, a fire began, one which would eventually engulf much of the city. It has never been conclusively determined whether the fire was set intentionally or by accident. As it raged, Kutuzov and the other Russian leaders pulled 30 to 40 kilometers away from the city, systematically plundering the countryside around Moscow as they went. Then they waited. In Moscow, Napoleon was racked by indecision. He had conquered Russia's old capital and seemingly struck a blow against the Russians, but now he was stuck without a clear plan. Furthermore, Kutuzov and the Tsar delayed any plans he might have had to now march northwestwards to try to seize St. Petersburg, entering into tentative peace agreements that are generally perceived as having been little more than a ruse to delay the Emperor of the French even further as La Grande Armée's resources were depleted, and what would turn out to be one of the coldest winters in Russia in modern times set in. Napoleon belatedly realized his error and ordered the abandonment of Moscow and a march back westwards to Poland in mid-October 1812. Kutuzov had now gained the initiative, as his army was better resourced and better prepared for the sequence of events that was beginning. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow all the way back to Poland and Lithuania would take over 6 weeks in an increasingly cold Russia. His men had little or no food or resources, and they were now being harried by Russian forces that constantly ambushed divisions of La Grande Armée as they trudged westwards through western Russia and Belarus. Kutuzov deployed a cautious approach during this. Napoleon's situation was fatally compromised by the strategic decision to abandon Moscow to him while also systematically depriving him of any resources. At the same time, the French army was still large enough that a direct engagement could result in a decisive French victory. He therefore avoided all-out clashes, favouring attacks on isolated French divisions. For instance, he ordered Levin von Bennigsen, one of his senior commanders, to strike at the forces under the control of Joachim Murat, Napoleon's brother-in-law and one of his leading generals, near the village of Tarantino, just as the main French army was pulling out of Moscow. The numerically superior Russians inflicted several thousand casualties before breaking off. In the weeks that followed, a similar pattern was observed. Kutuzov's forces also planned their ambushes in such a way as to direct Napoleon into taking the same route back westwards that his armies had travelled along during August and September. This meant the countryside they passed through had already been plundered by them 2 months earlier, and there were few resources they could acquire on a second visit. As a result, the French began to freeze and starve as they marched back westwards. By November, they were forced into eating their own horses. There were 2 major battles fought between Kutuzov and Bonaparte's forces following Napoleon's departure from Moscow. The Battle of Maloyaroslavets, west of Russia on the 24th of October, and the Battle of Krasnoy in the Smolensk Oblast near the modern-day border between Russia and Belarus over several days in mid-November. The Battle of Maloyaroslavets saw Kutuzov lead a contingent of some 25,000 men to harry the flanks of Napoleon's forces not long after they began a coordinated retreat from Moscow. His plan was to try to coerce the French and their allies into taking the more northern route westwards past the Mozhaisk region towards Smolensk. This was the same route that much of the French forces had passed through in September, and owing to their previous passage and a systematic policy of scorched earth, there were no food stores here or fodder for their horses to acquire. By harrying the French sufficiently at Maloyaroslavets to force them along this route, Kutuzov ensured the further destruction of much of Napoleon's army. When he engaged them at Krasnoy 3 weeks later, the situation was desperate for the French. Starving, freezing, and with much of their cavalry gone, Kutuzov's army, which included tens of thousands of Cossacks and cavalry, engaged in a continuous series of hit-and-run attacks on the French. Thousands of men of La Grande Armée were killed over 4 days, and tens of thousands were cut off from the main army and taken prisoner. As a consequence, it was a shattered husk of Napoleon's army that limped back to Poland and Lithuania in December. Kutuzov was the hero of the Russian defense of their homeland against the French invasion, and Bonaparte's continental empire was now in danger of quickly collapsing. Maloyaroslavets and Krasnoy marked the pinnacle of Kutuzov's career. The decision to abandon Moscow and deprive the French of the resources they needed to survive the winter was a masterstroke, which was followed up on brilliantly as the French fled back west to Poland. Tsar Alexander, with whom Mikhail had a very difficult relationship over the years, leading to him being ostracized to Kiev and the Balkans after the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, awarded him the greatest of honors after the defeat of the invasion of 1812. Henceforth, Kutuzov was to be known as His Serene Highness and carry the title Knyaz, a Slavic term meaning the equivalent of prince. He was also made Duke of Smolensk, his aristocratic title being named after the region of Western Russia and Belarus, where he had effectively destroyed Napoleon's dreams of European domination. And yet Mikhail's work was not over. As soon as Napoleon limped back to the Duchy of Warsaw in December 1812, he bolted across Europe in a lightning-fast journey to Paris. There he began preparing to raise a new army to fight the new coalition which was being assembled to fight him. Initially, it was led by the British, Russians and Prussians, though eventually Austria would join in the course of 1813, and the French were also facing an escalating series of rebellions in Spain and other regions. Between the autumn of 1813 and the spring of 1814, his empire was conquered, and he was forced from the throne in April 1814. Tsar Alexander entered Paris around the same time, but Kutuzov would not be amongst the victorious coalition commanders in the French capital that late spring. He had died on the 28th of April 1813 in the Silesia region of Poland, while preparations were being made for the final major campaign against Bonaparte in Germany. Kutuzov's death at around 65 years of age on Prussian soil came in the midst of the War of the Sixth Coalition. There was no capacity to return his body to Russia for a state burial, and he was initially buried in Silesia. His grave there became the centerpiece of the Russian Cemetery of Honor at Bolesławec, where Russian soldiers at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and much later, at the end of the Second World War, who had died in Central Europe were interred. Later, his remains were exhumed, and he was given a state burial in Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg. He was lionized in the century that followed as a hero of Russia's first great patriotic defense of its homeland by an invader from the West. In 1831, the great Russian poet and playwright Alexander Pushkin wrote a verse about his experience of visiting Kutuzov's tomb. It starts, With head inclined, I stand before the tomb of sainted one of yore, and all's asleep. But here some torches now gild in church's nighted gloom, building to a conclusion in which he states that silence fills this sacred room. You rest forever, still and frozen, in splendor of your hero's tomb. Kutuzov was also a central character in Leo Tolstoy's epic masterpiece of Russia during the era of the Napoleonic Wars, War and Peace. Written in the 1860s, the Count's work focuses on the years leading up to and during the invasion of Russia by the French. Kutuzov features prominently as a humble defender of Russia in the second half of the book, as a counterpoint to Napoleon's violent pursuit of glory. Finally, when Russia was yet again invaded by a foreign foe from the West, this time Nazi Germany in 1941, Kutuzov's legacy was exploited by Soviet propagandists to lionize the war effort. An Order of Kutuzov was even established as a military honor to acknowledge the service of Red Army officers deemed to have made a major contribution to this latest patriotic defense of Russia. Mikhail Kutuzov was one of the most successful generals of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. He was born into a relatively privileged background in the middle of the 18th century and was central to the nation's many wars against the Turks between the late 1760s and early 1790s. But it was events further west which would shine a European spotlight on him. As the French Revolutionary Wars morphed into the Napoleonic Wars, and after his mentor Alexander Suvorov died in 1800, Kutuzov became one of the leading generals of the only nation besides Britain that was able to defy Napoleon's ambitions to dominate all of Europe. He was cast into the wilderness after Austerlitz, not because his view of the battle had been incorrect, but seemingly because he had foreseen the doomed nature of Tsar Alexander's plans. Thereafter, the governance of Kiev and a third war with the Ottomans beckoned, but the invasion of his homeland by Napoleon in 1812 proved a window for rehabilitation. He emerged in the autumn and winter of that year as the hero of the patriotic defense of Russia, the mastermind of the strategy to abandon Moscow to the French and then simply wait for them to starve and run out of resources. A brilliant hit-and-run campaign of attacks against the French lines as they retreated decimated La Grande Armée and paved the way for the ultimate defeat of Napoleon in the years that followed. Kutuzov would not live to see this final victory, though Tolstoy would forever immortalize his actions in War and Peace. He holds an important, though often underappreciated place in the annals of European military history. What do you think of Mikhail Kutuzov? Was he the great architect of the defeat of Napoleon in 1812? Or did the Russian winter do most of the work for him? And was Kutuzov's legacy simply burnished by Tolstoy's War and Peace? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.